This little independent country was once the world's richest country. The name of this country is Nauru. It is a small island nation located in the Pacific Ocean with a land mass of just 8 square miles. It takes a maximum of 20 minutes to drive the whole country by car, and every journey returns to its starting point, as there is only one ring road. It is the third smallest nation in the world. Nauru became one of the richest countries in the world in the 1960s, but in the early 21st century, Nauru faced economic challenges. So how did Nauru become the richest country in the world? What mistakes did they make that led to them squandering this wealth? And finally, how did this tiny country actually end up worse off in the long run? Nauru is surrounded by massive coral reefs preventing large ships from approaching the shore. Until recently, the locals on this isolated island had so much wealth that they didn't even know what to do with it. Once rich in phosphate deposits in 1975, Nauru became the country with the highest GDP per capita in the world. Nauru was first discovered by Europeans in 1789 when a British ship passed by, a piece of land covered with a green central plateau, overgrown with swaying palms and framed with white sand beaches. The island's natural beauty led the British to call it Pleasant Island. In 1899, German geologist Albert Ellis discovered that this plateau had high-quality phosphate reserves. Once as valuable as gold, phosphate is a raw material boosting productivity in agriculture, and during the First World War, Australia quickly annexed and turned Nauru into an overseas mining field. Except for Japan's brief occupation in 1942, the extracted phosphate was sold to the world for years at extremely low prices. Some old people say that in this cell here, the Japanese used to pile people in and then close that up, put some gasoline from the rooftop, and then burn them in there. Those who don't want to work for them. In the years between 1945 and 1968, phosphate mining activities reached new record highs. When the Naurusians finally achieved their independence, nobody was forcing them to mine phosphate anymore. But by this point, their entire economy already revolved around exporting this natural resource. Independent Nauru had lost 1/3 of its islands to the mines, and the inhabitants lived around to by now. Even ghastly attractive land, a barren moonland. All economies are limited by the factors of production, land, labor, and capital. It's just in the case of Nauru, these limitations were extreme. This island has a tiny population that wasn't skilled in doing anything other than digging smelly rocks out of the ground. The size of their nation and its isolated position in the world meant that many industries just weren't feasible. And while phosphorus mining had made the island a lot of money, most of it at this point had been claimed by the nations that held the island as their colony. They didn't have the infrastructure or expertise to develop any other industries, so phosphate exports were further increased to milk the cow while she was still alive. They really had no way of competitively doing anything else. It was already apparent that the supply of phosphate would run out within a lifespan or two, but that did not stop the Naurusians from rightfully demanding their share of the pie. This initiated an epoch of Nauru's history, where some called it the wealthiest little island in the Pacific. A little more than a decade after their independence, Nauru became internationally hailed as the single richest country in the world on a per capita basis. In 1981, they had a GDP per capita of $27,000, which translates to $88,000 today. For comparison, the US GDP per capita was $14,000 at the time. This means the average Nauruan was twice as rich as the average American. Many inhabitants were able to be unemployed by choice. At the same time, all sorts of crazy stories happened in Nauru. Sports cars were the accessory to possess, despite the country's small size. You can drive around the entire perimeter of the island at a leisurely pace in 1 hour, hardly the ideal place for drag racing. One police chief decided to bring a Lamborghini to the island only to realize he did not fit behind the wheel. The reason he was unable to drive his new toy was part of a looming health crisis on the island. By 1980, an epidemiologist declared Nauru to have an obesity epidemic. The underlying factors were increased wealth and poor food choices. Junk food consumption skyrocketed, and still in 2002, the country was ranked the worst of 170 nations by the World Health Organization. In terms of average body mass index, a Naurusian's life expectancy is only slightly above 60. The healthy indigenous foods, such as coconuts and fish, got replaced by imported foods. Another consequence of mining, the poor health of the workforce can have severe economic consequences as well. Not fitting behind the wheel of your new Lamborghini suddenly becomes a very small issue considering the overall implications of this obesity crisis. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the health situation of Nauru. Back then and now, most meals consist of instant noodles, white rice, anything out of a can, and soda. Tobacco and binge drinking are also common. The decades of phosphate mining destroyed the natural environment to such a great extent that the agricultural industry became almost non-existent. And spoiler alert, but the economic downturn after the phosphate ran out meant that most Naurusians could only afford cheap processed foods. During the colonial days, the Naurusian people only received a small fraction of the wealth generated by the phosphate mining. Given this background, it was rather economic necessity that prompted them to continue mining after independence, rather than greed. Having to import all goods, including food and water, is not a sustainable way of living. Since all the attention went to phosphate mining, nobody bothered to waste time on manufacturing or agriculture. For agriculture, the land was too exploited anyway. After all, the topsoil got removed for mining activities. The necessity to diversify was no news to the country's leaders, and they did try to venture into different industries. One was offshore banking, resulting in licenses for roughly 400 foreign banks at the beginning of the 1990s. These Nauruan bank branches were initially a huge success, but the strategy behind the success was, let's say, dubious at best. Customers did not need to visit the island to open a bank account. With so-called economic citizenship, one could easily get a Naurusian passport through which the country becomes a paradise for money laundering and tax evasion. The government earned millions through fees, but it was not the solution to fix Nauru's economy after running out all of its phosphate treasure. In 2005, Nauru stopped the offshore banking business, and it started requiring a physical presence to obtain a bank license. This was not due to a change of heart, but rather due to immense international pressure, the US even categorizing Nauru as a rogue state under the 2001 Patriot Act. Now, another way to deal with Dutch disease is to take the Norwegian approach, which is to set up a sovereign wealth fund designed to invest the natural resource wealth in a way that will generate dividends for generations to come. A lot of earnings from the phosphate boom had been invested abroad, meant for a time when their treasure would dwindle. This is a great idea that was unfortunately not implemented well at all. Risky investments and plain old fraud made the country lose a lot of its investments, ultimately pushing Nauru to the verge of bankruptcy. Not even the discovery of secondary phosphate deposits and the subsequent second phosphate rush changed the imminent economic collapse. The country went so broke, even the central bank went bankrupt. Their overseas real estate assets were repossessed and their airplanes were seized. Oh yes, planes. Nauru had launched a national airline in the 1970s. There was, however, one more glorious attempt to secure financial well-being. Nauru infamously became one of the biggest disasters in the history of London theater. Nauru had earlier invested in Leonardo The Musical, A Portrait of Love. The musical depicted a fictional love triangle between Da Vinci, Mona Lisa, and a soldier. Needless to say, the musical became a huge flop at a time when Nauru could not afford any kind of financial loss. By 2001, they were completely out of phosphate, and their foreign investments had almost all ended up in failure. By this point, the country was completely broke and had a paltry GDP of $32 million. Adjusted for inflation, unemployment skyrocketed to 90%, and the school system mostly collapsed. Just a reminder, we are talking about the richest country in the world just years earlier. Unfortunately, this is only the beginning of one of the darker chapters as a result of the economic misery Nauru faced at the turn of the century. In 2001, the large Norwegian freighter, MV Tampa, wanted to dock in Australia. Earlier, the crew rescued more than 400, mostly Afghan, refugees from a sinking boat. Australia refused the MV Tampa to enter Australian waters and instead found the so-called Pacific Solution, an offshore detention camp on Nauru. Australia paid Nauru for their efforts of keeping immigrants away from their shores. It also created employment for the island and led to some bizarre situations. Nauru was still in no position to wave off millions of dollars in return for cooperation. The client state was far too intertwined with their large neighbor to refuse the new proposal. Even the fierce hostility of many Naurusians did not change this policy. Over the past 2 decades, Australia has employed Nauru's detention services on and off, and they continue to house migrants to this day. This, along with foreign aid, mostly from Australia, has kept the island economy afloat, barely. James Aingemea, an old minister of the Nauru Congregational Church, was born in 1911 and practically saw it all, even the musical. Aingemea lamented to a New York Times reporter saying, "I wish we'd never discovered that phosphate. I wish Nauru could look like it was before when I was a boy. It was so beautiful. There were trees, it was green everywhere, and we could eat fresh coconuts and breadfruit. Now I see what's happened here and I want to cry." Today, Nauru's main industry is outsourcing refugee detention centers. While this remains a lucrative source of revenue for the country, it does not build the technological capabilities needed to create more advanced industries down the line should this singular revenue stream ever dry up. Because of this, Nauru gets a 2 out of 10. Altogether, this gives Nauru an average score of 4 out of 10, which puts it down here on the Economics Explained national leaderboard. This small island, with wounds that can never be healed, basically stands in front of us as a summary of what is going on in the world, and as a lesson that humanity should always remember. Thanks.